Welcome to the PSR's author interview series, where we take time to talk with the authors, researchers, and academics that publish work with us. Today, I will be talking to Dr. Kamil Bernaerts regarding his paper, Affect or Emotions, Disaggregating Affective Polarisation to Explain Support for Liberal Democracy in Belgium and the United Kingdom. Dr. Bernaerts is a postdoctoral researcher in political science at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. He is also guest professor at Universiteit Hasselt and academic fellow at the Hannah Arendt Institute. Hi there, Dr. Bernaerts. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. We'll launch right in. So could you please tell us a little bit about your paper, its subject focus, and maybe a bit of a background to the research?
Of course. Thanks for having me. So the paper is basically on the link between, or very broadly, on the link between affective polarization and democracy, or support for liberal democracy more specifically. And it's part of my PhD dissertation, where I really tried to understand, is polarization a problem for democracy? And if yes, why, or under which conditions, which mechanisms, and so on. Because as we, as you might know, or as people familiar with the field might know, there is some argument, some debate on whether affective polarization specifically, which is a specific form of polarization, which deals mostly with affect or dislike between opposing political camps, whether that form of polarization is actually problematic for a long time, especially during the past decade, especially coming also from America. So American literature indeed found some effects and indeed showed us, that we should focus on this form of polarization because it is problematic for democracy. And lots of American authors have indeed, and some Europeans as well, have indeed shown that it can be problematic. And I do not question that, but at the same time, there's also some research that contests this evidence and finds that for example, the relation between polarization or affective polarization and democratic norms is not that straightforward or not that robust, especially in experimental research, which is also where I came in 2021, 2022, when I started my PhD. This kind of debate was erupting. And I was also very interested myself in, okay, is affective polarization actually problematic? Because when you think about it, disliking people from the other camp to a certain extent can be normal in a democracy, right? It's completely fine that you don't like your political opponent, as long, and that's of course where this paper comes in, as long as it does not mean that you start hating them or start becoming more hostile towards them. And we all feel intuitively that there is some difference between disliking someone, which is democratically still okay, and hating one, becoming hostile, or even in extreme cases, becoming violent towards one's opponent. In these cases, it's without question problematic for democracy. But the exact, how do you say that, exact difference between when polarization becomes problematic is, to my knowledge at least, or was to my knowledge, and it still isn't exactly very clear where that tipping point is located precisely. And that's where this paper tried to come in. And I think it had three main goals in the beginning. I won't go into the results yet, but the goals were, first of all, I wanted to understand whether there are other forms of affective polarization beyond the partisan focus that we see in the literature today. And as I said before, affective polarization is this spread between dislike scores towards various parties, and especially in the European context, this is more complicated because, for example, in Belgium, where I did the study, but also in the UK, although the UK is a special case, there are more than two parties, right? And people can have attitudes towards more than two parties, and they do. While in the US, where the research is originated, it's just the Democrats and the Republicans. So there it's quite easy to measure this. In our case, it isn't, and therefore there have been some new measures also on affective polarization that indeed measure this spread of dislike, but it's always towards political parties. And one of the reasons probably that the results are not always that robust, I argue also in the paper, is that it might have to do with the fact that there's also other conflicts in society that are very salient, very important, that are not necessarily linked or not linked one-to-one to political parties. So that's the first thing I wanted to do, look, and in my case, at the whole debate around wokeness, the whole conflict about wokeness, and look at how this generates certain feelings, affect, and polarization. And then secondly, and that's what I said before, secondly, I also wanted to understand, okay, we look at dislike in affective polarization, that's the gold standard, you could say. But of course, as I said, there is more to feelings and engaging with other people than only dislike. There is also hate, there's also social distance, there's different, in the paper I call them gestalts or gestalts of affective polarization, different gears of affective polarization, you could say. And by throwing them all into dislike, we might misunderstand what dislike actually means and what these underlying emotions, they might be masked by this dislike measurement. And that's why I also included dislike, of course, but also social distance, so not wanting to engage with others. And lastly, in a sort of escalatory manner, lastly, I included negative emotions, hate, anger, and frustration, which are arguably different than just disliking someone, as I said in the beginning. And then the third goal, to be short as I can, sorry for that. The third goal is to also take into account the standpoint that your opponent has on democracy, because again, what I've been saying until now assumes that if we look at different types of polarization or different types of emotions between people, there is no knowledge yet on what the people you dislike or what the people you polarize against, what they think of democracy in the first place. And I think that's crucial when you want to understand people's individual support of democracy. Because if you encounter someone who is vocally against democracy, it might be a natural and normal reaction that you dislike that person, even start hating that person because you feel deeply about democracy. You really care about democracy. And not taking that into account might again mask the relationship between polarization or affective polarization and democratic support. So that was, in a nutshell, I think, what the research started from.
Lovely, thank you. And so you present 3 core findings in the paper. Could you talk us a little bit through each of those 3 findings, please?
Of course. Yeah, the first finding, I think, was the most surprising to me personally, and that's about this partisan dislike. So maybe for a bit of context, I did a survey experiment in Belgium and the United Kingdom with 1,000 respondents in each country and a national representative sample. And I measured all these different kinds of polarization, including, of course, the classical affective polarization measure regarding the different spreads, the different like scores towards political parties. And what I theorized that it might not be that important for understanding the relationship with support for liberal democracy, I still thought in the back of my head when I was designing the experiment and also the survey that it would still be negatively related, that more affective polarization would still mean, regarding political parties, would still mean that your support for liberal democracy would be a bit, at least a bit lower. I theorized it wouldn't be that impressive, and the most of the explanatory power would be in the other types of polarization, but still, I expected some negative results. And what I found was completely the opposite. For political parties, the effects are still moderate, so it's not that it's a complete reversal. But still, I found that the more people or the bigger people's spread was between their like scores towards political parties, which is in a nutshell what affective polarization measures. In both countries, this was related, if anything, with more support for liberal democracy. And this is something I did not really expect, but when you read the literature on it, it also makes kind of sense because other authors also found that affective polarization, for example, is linked with political engagement. People that are more politically engaged also tend to be more polarized, and people that are more politically engaged care more about democracy. So there is some sort of a relation there that does make sense. But still, to me, starting from the polarization field, I was a bit surprised to find that result. But it only, of course, affirmed what I was theorizing in the theoretical part of the paper. And then for the second and the third part, those I took together because the survey experiment was designed in such a way that I primed people with a pro and an anti-woke version of a person, which I called Sam. And I only have data in these 2 groups. I don't have a control condition, so I don't, unfortunately, which is something I should have done. And there's some methodological things as anyone I would do differently now. But I don't have that data, so I only have data in the pro and the anti-woke condition. So you have to take those together. Why? Because I found a very important interaction effect there, meaning that it's not only about the kind of polarization that people feel, and I come to that in a sec, but it's also, as I said before, about the kind of person you are confronted with. Is he or she in favor of democracy, or in favor of liberal democracy, in favor of protection for liberal democratic rights, such as minority protections, which is something you could see under the wokeness debate, or are they against all of this? And indeed, I found that in the anti-woke conditions, so people that were confronted with an anti-woke version of Sam, the more they disliked this person, the more they supported liberal democracy. While the opposite was true for people that were confronted with a pro-woke condition, people that were confronted with a pro-woke condition, the more they disliked that person, the less they supported liberal democracy. And that seems a bit difficult to understand at first grasp, but when you think about it, it does make sense, because the more you dislike someone who does not really respect democratic principles, it makes sense that the more you dislike that person, that the more you also like liberal democracy. There's no causal relationship here, of course, but I can see why those people would also be more supportive for liberal democracy. But interestingly, this was true for affective distance, so dislike, and for social distance, but not for the emotional component. People that hated or were angry or frustrated with Sam, the vignette in question, were always less supportive of democracy. There was no interaction effect there whatsoever. You can also see that in the graph that I inserted in the paper. It's very interesting, because that's also a sort of different attitude that I captured there. Presumably, the more you hate the other, you could say it quite bluntly, the more you, or the less you will support liberal democracy, irrespective of what this person stands for. And I think that's a very important and interesting finding also for the field on affective polarization.
Wonderful, thank you. And you mentioned there, as we all experience as academics, there are things we would have done differently when it comes to our methodologies. Could you talk us through, were there any specific challenges or difficulties that you experienced in your kind of methodology, or your method, your data collection? Anything you would like to share with our audience in terms of challenges in this regard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, I would have done tons of things differently, as anyone would, of course. But I think the most important things are that I did not check enough the survey design before I fielded it. It was also due to how my PhD was organized. I did all of this myself, of course, with help of my supervisors. But still, I wasn't embedded in some sort of a project, so I really had to go to people to ask for feedback. And I did so as much as I could, but my network then was still limited. So the feedback you get is, of course, very valuable, but things that you now think would have been done differently could have been things that people could have said me if I had brought it to more people and asked for feedback to more people. So that's something I would definitely suggest to people that are currently in the phase, and I think everyone knows this, but still it's important, that are still in the phase of collecting data, or just before the collection of the data, is to present your data analysis idea, design on conferences, at workshops, go to senior colleagues and give them what you're thinking or what you're planning on doing, and ask them for their honest feedback. Because in my case, for example, I also distinguish between idea-based and identity-based kinds of polarization in the survey experiments, so in the conditions. There's a note in the paper on how I dealt with it in this paper, but it was more of a liability in the end. It's very difficult to persuade reviewers why I had it, because I didn't use it in the end, because there's no effects there, and also the ways in which I framed these vignettes are a bit problematic. So I would have hoped to have left that out afterwards. But of course, once you have the data, you can't go back. It also costs a lot of money to collect these things, so I had to deal with it. But that's something, for example, that a more senior colleague, for example, could have, or any colleague whatsoever, could have helped me in saying that maybe these different conditions might not be that interesting, or it might have been better to put them at the end of the survey somewhere where I could still isolate the other questions, because now they were infected by this problem, because I first confronted them with the conditions and then asked all the other questions in the survey, meaning that all the questions in the survey part of in the experiment part, of course, are part or have this problem, are confronted with this problem. So yeah, long story short, go to your supervisor, go to conferences and workshops, and present what you're planning on doing before doing it. Because as genius it might seem to you, as the person you're designing it, it probably isn't. And there's probably some things you can learn from others. But yeah, that would be the biggest thing I would change.
That's great. Thank you. I think that's very good advice for any early career researcher or
Mhm.
PhD researcher in the design phase. So thank you
Yes.
very much. Um, so yeah, it was a fascinating paper. We would love to hear about your future research plans. What are you working on now? What would you intend on working on next?
Yeah, so I still love it very much. Everything I did in my PhD, because you often hear people that are a bit tired of their subject matter in their PhD, which I can totally understand. But in my case, I still completely love it. I find it very interesting, especially now, unfortunately, in this time of democratic crisis or democratic decline. There is lots of talk and thoughts on whether polarization does or does not impact this democratic decline that we're seeing all over the world, but especially in Western democracies like, of course, the US, but also here in Europe. And I think I'm with the future plans in my research agenda. I'm really building on insights I got from the PhD, like for example of this paper of distinguishing between different groups or different kinds of conflict in the first place. To really not really disregard the whole parties measurement, because I think there's still much or many value in using political parties as primary groups to measure conflict and polarization. But I think there's also others, especially in the multi-party systems like in Belgium. And I used here the wokeness debate, but I think there are many other conflicts that are interesting, related also to cleavage theory and those kind of literatures. So that's something I'm currently thinking about and writing grant proposals about. Also, the bigger question on how much or which kind of conflict can democracies deal with? It's a very old question, you could say. It's something that all political theorists also have been discussing since the beginning of the idea of democracy, but it's still a very relevant question today. So everything that vaguely relates to that interests me, meaning that I'm doing very much at the same time. And also the more bigger determinants of affective polarization. There's lots of research there that's very interesting. But for example, there's a paper I'm co-authoring with a colleague on social cohesion that I'm very passionate about. Is there a link between different kinds of social cohesion and social capital and affective polarization? People that are closely knit in their communities, maybe they're less polarized or they're more polarized. You could see an argument for both. But also the more socioeconomic characteristics, which I think in this period of austerity and budget cuts all over the place is something that might be interesting. There's also much literature there. And yeah, everything else that is vaguely related to understanding how polarization can help us understand this democratic decline that we're living through, this democratic crisis that we're living through. All of that is basically on my plate, meaning way too much, and also difficult sometimes to prioritize. But I think it's a very fascinating concept. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly not a small subject that you're trying to tackle
No.
there. So
No.
plenty of research to keep you going into the future.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Bernaerts, thank you very much. That is all of my core questions. Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, not necessarily, but maybe one thing I forgot to say before, which came to my mind now, is another thing that surprised me in the findings. Basically, the fact that I specifically chose Belgium and the United Kingdom because they're two different institutional designs. And in another part of my PhD, I look at institutional design and how this affects polarization generally all over the world. And I expected, based on these prior findings, that consensus democracies like Belgium would be less polarized, and there the effects of polarization would be less severe than in majoritarian democracies like the UK still is. Who knows after the next elections what the UK is going, or in which direction the UK is going through? But at the time of my data collection, it still was a majoritarian democracy. Um, but surprisingly, there were no differences. So almost all the relations that I found went in the same direction and were also somewhat in the same effect size, which is something that I'm still trying to understand why this is the case. Maybe it's because I'm measuring psychological things rather than bigger political, institutional, or things that political institutions have a grasp on. I don't know. I'm still debating, and wondering. But that's also something I want to investigate further in the future, because I think there's also some interesting things to unpack there.
Okay. Well, Dr. Bernaerts, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been the PSR's author interview series, where we take time to speak with the academics, researchers, and writers who have published work with us. To learn more about PSR, check out our website or find us on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. PSR is a Political Studies Association journal.